Hi. So, I made a video on Hanafis, and you guys quite liked it. So next up, Malikis. Maliki Madhab is the second most widely followed school of thought in the world, with around 500 million Muslims following this school today. That's roughly 25% of the entire Muslim population. We're talking about most of North Africa, most of West Africa, and a good chunk of the Gulf states, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE. But Maliki Madhab is different to every other madhab out there, and it's very interesting. The idea that one city, listen closely, one specific city, Medina, carries a form of evidence that no hadith book can fully replace. We'll get to exactly what that means. But first, who was Imam Malik? His full name was Malik ibn Anas, born in Medina around 711 CE, so about 79 years after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. At that time, the Sahaba were gone, but their students, a lot of them, were still alive and still teaching. Imam Malik grew up surrounded by that generation, and he knew exactly how rare that was. The chain back to the Prophet ﷺ was still short and still alive, and Malik was determined to learn everything he could from those people. He was serious about knowledge from a very young age. There's a well-known story about his mother. She used to dress him in his best clothes before sending him out to study. Obviously, not to show off, but because knowledge should be approached with a certain level of respect and dignity. And there's another story about him that before Malik would sit down and narrate a single hadith to his students, he would perform wudu, put on his best clothes, and sit properly, every single time. He studied under some of the greatest scholars in Medina, including Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, one of the earliest and most important figures in the whole science of hadith. Another was Nafi, the student of Hazrat Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Hazrat Umar. So the chain Malik was learning from was about as direct as it gets at that point in history. And the thing worth noting, Imam Malik also studied under Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Same teacher, by the way, that Abu Hanifa also studied with. Malik spent his entire life in Medina. He didn't travel trade routes like Abu Hanifa, because in his view, the knowledge was right here. Right here. Why would you leave? Okay, so now let's get into the thing that actually makes this school different from all the others. Every madhab uses the Quran and the Sunnah as its foundation. That's a given. But after that, the schools start to differ in how they work things out. Abu Hanifa, as we covered, leaned heavily on reason and analogy. If the text doesn't spell it out, you think it through logically. Imam Malik did something else, something interesting. He said, we don't just have the text, we have something the other cities don't have. We have the living practice of Medina. He called it Amal Ahl al-Medina, the practice of the people of Medina. His argument was this: the Prophet ﷺ lived there. He prayed there, walked through its markets, settled disputes in its streets. After he passed away, his companions stayed there. Then their students stayed there. The way things were done in Medina, generation after generation, was a form of continuous living proof. Not just words reported in a narration, actual practice passed down in an unbroken chain. So according to Malik, the practice of the people of Medina sometimes supersedes a hadith because that practice was considered living sunnah. Now that's a bold claim. And yes, other scholars pushed back on it hard. The argument being, what about the companions who left Medina and settled in Kufa, in Egypt, in Syria? Their practice counts too. Why is Medina automatically the gold standard? Here's a real example of how this played out. There's a well-known disagreement between Imam Malik and Imam al-Shafi'i. Yes, a real one. Imam al-Shafi'i, who was actually Malik's own student, and we'll get to him in the next video over the issue of raising the hands during prayer. Malik's position was shaped largely by what he saw consistently practiced in Medina. Al-Shafi'i disagreed based on specific hadith narrations. It's a debate that went on for centuries, and it's one of the reasons Maliki fiqh looks different to the other schools in certain areas. Now here's where Imam Malik does something that separates him from Abu Hanifa entirely. He wrote a book. But not just any book. one of the most important books in the history of Islamic scholarship. He called it the Muwatta. The word means the approved, or the well-trodden path. And the name was chosen deliberately, because that's exactly what the book was trying to capture. Imam Malik himself explained the title like this. He said he showed his book to 70 jurists of Medina, and every single one of them approved it. So he named it the Approved. 70 scholars signing off on one book. That's not a small thing. It's a combination of narrations from the Prophet ﷺ, rulings from companions, practices of the scholars of Medina, and Imam Malik's own conclusions, all woven together. It's a big book, over 1,000 pages. Imam Malik didn't just write the Muwatta once and leave it. He kept revising it for 40 years. Scholars who studied under him in his early years had a slightly different version to the ones who came later, which tells you he was still learning at the same time he was teaching. Now here's another interesting thing. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, the same caliph who tried to get Abu Hanifa to become chief judge and threw him in prison when he refused, he approached Imam Malik with a different proposal. He wanted to take the Muwatta and make it the official law of the entire empire. One book from Spain to Central Asia. Malik refused. He said the companions had spread out to different regions and each area had inherited something from them. It wouldn't be right to just override all of that with one book. He had the chance to make his school the dominant force across the entire Muslim world. And he said no, because it wouldn't be just. Now, just like Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik had his own moment where staying honest cost him. In 762 CE, there was an uprising in Medina against the Abbasid Caliph. So the authorities added a condition. If you rebelled or broke your allegiance, your wives would be divorced and your slaves free. But Imam Malik issued a ruling. If someone forces you to give allegiance, that allegiance means nothing. Meaning, if you swore loyalty to the Caliph under pressure, that oath wasn't binding on you. Now, whether he intended it that way or not, that ruling gave the people a religious cover. You can imagine how that landed with the authorities. The governor of Medina had him publicly flogged, beaten up. He never apologized and he never retracted the ruling. After the flogging, Malik's reputation didn't collapse. Instead, it grew. People across the Muslim world heard what had happened. A scholar got punished for refusing to bend the ruling in favor of power. And instead of turning people away from him, it drew them toward him. Students started coming to Medina from further and further away, specifically to learn from this man. And interestingly, when Abu Ja'far al-Mansur later met Imam Malik, he apologized and swore that he had not ordered it and had no prior knowledge of it, and was unhappy when he learned about it. Okay, so the Maliki school didn't spread the way the Hanafi school did. The Hanafis had the Ottomans and the Mughals, two massive empires that adopted the school as official state law and carried it everywhere. Because of that, Maliki spread differently. Instead of moving east, it moved westward into North Africa and into Andalusia, which is modern-day Spain and Portugal. And in those regions, it took root deeply. North Africa became, and still is, almost entirely Maliki. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, West Africa too, Mali, Senegal, Niger, Nigeria. To this day, Malikism is the largest school amongst Muslims in Africa. Because the school dominated in Andalusia, some of the most important intellectual figures in Islamic history came out of the Maliki tradition. Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, the philosopher whose works on Aristotle shaped medieval European thought, was himself a Maliki jurist and judge. Ibn Khaldun, who basically invented the science of sociology and history, Maliki. Ibn Battuta, the greatest traveler in pre-modern history, also Maliki. And actually, Ibn Battuta is worth pausing on for a second because he was also a scholar. This man traveled roughly 75,000 miles. Let me say that again. 750 over 30 years. He went from Morocco all the way to China, down into sub-Saharan Africa, across Central Asia. And everywhere he went, he took the Maliki teachings with him. Okay, so quickly, what does Maliki actually look like in practice compared to other schools? A few things. In prayer, Maliki Muslims generally let their hands rest at their sides rather than folding them. Most other schools fold. Small, visible difference, but it's the first thing people notice. In the Maliki school, the taslim at the end of prayer the salam is said only once, turning to the right. Other madhabs say it twice, once right and once left. There are also differences in wudu, in how fasting is approached, in marriage and divorce law. A lot of it traces back to that same core principle. What was the practice in Medina? And how do we stay closest to that? That school today has around 500 million followers across North Africa, West Africa, and parts of the Gulf. And next up is Shafiz. So comment below if you want that one.